Hey everybody, AJ back again for the Mighty Glue Stick channel, creating the most comprehensive collection of dragon ecologies I can because you told me to. Carrying on, we come to the Ferrous Dragons. Now, originating in the June 1991 Dragon magazine number 170 in an article by Jason M. Walker, these dragons do not have a story origin specific to any of the known realms, not Kryn, not Greyhawk, not Forgotten Realms. Narath of 4th edition hadn't been invented yet, perhaps they came from there. You don't have any evidence to place them anywhere except for the history they tell others, so they are a rare breed and frequently encountered, much as the gem dragons are an unusual find. However, at one point long ago, when the dragons had a world-spanning civilization, they were far more common and existed in a much larger variety than they do today. As the dragons tell it, when their civilization ruled, before the rise of the elven slaves and the savage human primitives or the giant servitor race called the dwarves, the Ferrous Dragons were the ruling class of the draconic world. They are, as a whole, lawfully aligned. So to them, civilization, organization, and empires are ingrained in their nature. All Ferrous Dragons are lawful, but the majority are evil, so unfortunately, much like the elven civilization which was to follow them, the empire imploded into civil war, and the brutality of it was so severe that many of the Ferrous Dragons' kind were annihilated and are now extinct on the mortal plane. There were originally 12 species of Ferrous Dragons. They're not known as that amongst themselves, or at that time. They have their own names in Draconic. 2 of those species are gone forever. Others are possibly on other planes of existence. The other Ferrous Dragons are silent on the subject of what happened to the dragons that lost. The war ended when the Nickel Dragons turned coat and joined with the supreme ruler of the Iron Dragons, and the current variety of dragons we know of today took claim of the entire world. But the damage was done, and the children of Tiamat and Bahamut outnumbered the Ferrous Dragons just as they do today. The Draconic Empire never recovered. So these are some of the most deadly dragons, and they have a rank according to their type, determined by their own lawful hierarchy. The supreme leader, kind of their immortal emperor, is the enormous iron dragon called Gruaglothor. That's a great name. All Ferrous Dragons are organized into family units, then by small clans of families, and each clan has a dominant leader, and each of the leaders is under the supervision of a sovereign. Sovereigns have a telepathic bond with all the clan leaders. In turn, all the sovereigns are in a telepathic bond with the most powerful iron dragon, Gruaglothor. So, it is said that Gruaglothor sees all and knows all that the other dragons do. So that pretty much keeps them in line. The Supreme Ruler is an interesting entity, as somehow he has achieved immortality in a unique method not fully understood by outsiders. Long ago, so the legend goes, the first of the Iron Dragons was Gruaglothor. He was killed by a flight of red dragons sent against him. As he died, he vowed he would even return from death to destroy them all. And sure enough, he seemed to return to life a year later, and every time he fell a year later, there he would be again, good as gold. The truth is, when he dies, another Iron Dragon who has been chosen amongst them goes into a state of hibernation and transformation, grows in size and power as they are infused with, and then somehow completely become Gruaglothor, burning with the hatred of 1,000 kings for the chromatic dragon's scum and plotting the return of the mighty Draconic Empire. So, who are these dragons? Let's talk about the types. First of all, while Ferrous Dragons share all the usual traits of metallic and chromatic dragons, they have some additional abilities. They can sense the location and amount of any non-precious metal, so excluding adamantine, mithril, platinum, gold, silver, and copper, with a range dependent on the age of the dragon, from as little as 30 feet to up to 360 feet. This metal sense makes it almost impossible for a typical armor-clad, weapon-loaded adventurer to get the drop on them. They can literally sense the party coming from any direction. This, more than any other reason, is why they are called Ferrous Dragons. It's of most concern to the adventurers. Some of them can shapeshift, some of them cannot. One breed in particular spends a lot of time shapeshifted and moving through the lands of the so-called civilized races. So let's get started and talk about, let's start with the Iron Dragons. These are the top of the ruling class. They're the most powerful of the Ferrous Dragons. They are the rulers of all of the Ferrous Dragons, and the sovereign Iron Dragon is said to be nearly unbeatable. They frequently assume the form of men to spy on the goings-on in the world and hope to bring about their rule once more. And so they may actually be involved in destabilizing other civilized races and plunging them into civil war in order to strengthen the overall prospects of dragons in that area. But the problem is, of course, is that they work against other dragons, particularly the chromatic dragons, and quite often they look down on metallic dragons. All of the iron dragons are of a lawful neutral alignment, so they are only interested in their own rules. So from the perspectives of somebody else, they may be seen as doing evil things because it's not in the best interest of humanoid races what these dragons do. But from the perspective of other dragons, they're lawful neutral. They don't attack unless they are attacked, unless their laws are broken, their mandates are ignored. And so other dragons tend to respect what the iron dragons lay down, because it's one more dragon kind that aren't actively hunting and killing them. So yeah, it's in the best interest of most of the other dragons. Iron dragons, they look a sort of a flat black when they are born. As they age, they begin to take on a glossy texture until the adult's dragon looks like it's a metallic black in colour, and then the scales continue to take on silver highlights until, as great worms, the scales look like moonlight reflecting on a rippling pool, a glossy black sheen to them. They speak their own tongue, a language common to all the Ferrous Dragons, and 20% of all hatchling iron dragons have the ability to communicate with any intelligent creature using telepathy within 60 feet. And this ability increases as they grow in age, to the point where the oldest of the dragons all have the telepathic abilities. They have two breath weapons: a cloud of sleep glass, 50 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 30 feet high, or a cone of superheated sparks, which blast out 90 feet long, 5 feet wide at the dragon's mouth, and 30 feet wide at the end. Creatures caught in the gas have to, they basically take electricity and heat damage from this. It's like a sort of a plasma-y type blast, quite spectacular to see. And from birth, iron dragons are immune to heat and flame of any sort and can polymorph self 3 times a day, which they continue to do so throughout their lives, developing their own personas as transformed individuals. So yeah. And they are the largest by age category. They start off at 6 to 18 feet in length and can grow to 150 to 163 feet in length just in their body alone, with the tail adding another 3 feet to 126 feet in length. So yeah. Like all of the Ferrous Dragons, if they are going to have any sort of spellcasting ability, it is always a sorceress class. They are always cross-class as a sorcerer. Yeah. It's worth talking about Graglathor, as he is one of the Iron Dragons. He is massive, much bigger than the other Iron Dragons. He's 185 feet long in the body, with a 140 foot long tail. And he is without fear. Because if he dies, he can literally reincarnate. He looks like another Iron Dragon in every other respect, and has that amazing ability for telepathy that he can use on any creature. He has the same breath weapon attacks, and yeah, his spell selections. He can heat metal, stone shape, pass through walls, and he casts spells as a 22nd level wizard. So he's unusual in that respect, in that he actually studies magic and has a very large wizard library. He dwells in a cavern far below one of the mightiest peaks in the world. From there he rules over the Ferrous Dragons, settling all disputes that they can't be handled by other dragon leaders, using their own laws, dispensing justice to those who cannot obey clan laws, and mating with his concubines in order to produce his eventual successor. So he is the progenitor of all of the Iron Dragons, and it is assumed that the other dragonkind are variants of the original Iron Dragons, but that's unclear. He sustains himself on a diet of iron ore, and iron ore is very important to both the diet and mating patterns and mating process of the Iron Dragons. So they quite often come into conflict with dwarves and anyone else who finds one of their large supplies of iron ore that these dragons covet and protect as their own. He will occasionally go hunting for better fare, which he considers delicacy. He is very fond of red dragon flesh. He's quite content to be left alone, where he will spend countless days devising ways to exterminate the red dragons. He has a tremendous store of knowledge and a wisdom that is epic in its scope. So if it is possible, in fact, to approach Graglathor, he is, again, he's a super genius. He's lawful, neutral, and alignment, although he's not neutral from the perspective of humanoid races, who he sees as nothing more than scum, slaves, or food. But if you can approach him, say if you polymorph yourself into another Iron Dragon, say, or some other type of dragon that he's not going to kill immediately, then you may actually converse with him and learn things about society and the world that will blow your mind. So, yeah, that's the Iron Dragons. Now, the other good dragons, you could say the only good dragons of this kind, are the Tungsten Dragons. They dwell in arid deserts, dry plains, so they quite often get into conflict with blue dragons, and they're not that fond of brass dragons either. They're no nonsense, dedicated to preservation and expansion of the forces of good. So they're a lawful good species that is like your ultimate stuck-up paladin. They're very Spock-like. They're very logical. They don't suffer idiots very lightly, including copper dragons, who they see as braggarts and idiots, and brass dragons, who are far too familiar with other races. Unfortunately, tungsten dragons usually limit their ability to organize and corral and build societies to their own territories and just their own kind. So they're not as overly dedicated to their draconic society as the Iron Dragons are. They keep mostly to themselves. They're not fond of intruders by any means, and many unfortunates are usually dealt with harshly because the dragons will just blast them first and ask questions later. The scales of the Tungsten Dragon are a deep forest green, flecked with a brown at birth. They lose the brown flecks and take on a metallic sheen as they reach adulthood, becoming more dull as they grow in age to a flat green as great worms. They speak their own language as usual, and the language common to all the Ferrous Dragons. They've got a 10% chance of having telepathy from birth, but as usual, by their great age, they have that telepathy out to 60 foot. They eliminate opponents whenever in the quickest and most efficient manner. In the pursuit of good, they are strong believers in the end justify the means, so they can actually do things which are quite devastating to other communities around them in order to preserve and present to represent the best interest of dragonkind in that area. So from other people's perspectives, their lawful goodness can be quite lawful evil from their perspective. They have a breath weapon, which is a cone of blasting molten sand, 70 feet long, 5 foot wide at the dragon's mouth, 20 foot wide at the base. Creatures caught in the sandblast they'll take half damage from managing to avoid it, beating the DC, or just get completely pelted by bludgeoning and burning damage. And I like to imagine that it actually coats them in an obsidian sort of layer of molten glass that gunks them up and weighs them down. Even if they save against it, their armor may be ruined by having to chip the stuff off them afterwards. And this is particularly devastating against other dragons. because this molten sand sticks to them like napalm, and they find it very hard to get off their scales, and it can impede their ability to fly. So tungsten dragons are particularly devastating in the war against other dragons. The tungsten dragons were dragon killers, as effective as a Behir in taking out other dragons. They have, again, sorceress powers. They can detect evil and good 3 times a day, detect lies. They can create sand clouds, which are the equivalent of a fog cloud spell. And they can cause spontaneous combustion in the things around them. They can cause people to burst into flames and burn brightly. They're quite devastating. They can be found in arid, warm climates, as I said, ranging from deep deserts to dry steppes. They spend their entire day patrolling their territories in search of intruders to defeat and wrongs to right. They are excellent parents, take care of their young until the juvenile age, but when the young are in juvenile age, they are either invited to stay with the family and serve their family interests, or go and stake their own claims. In other words, you're either with us or go forth, young one, and do your own thing. Like any other dragon, they can eat pretty much anything. They have a particular fondness for desert plants and are very careful not to unbalance the local ecosystem. So they actually do tend to groves of cactuses and that sort of thing. Probably make a wicked tequila. They're nearly a match for a big blue dragon, and several tungsten dragons will often band together to be rid of the evil blues, mainly because the blues have such a large retinue of creatures with them. As I've often mentioned, they're like the mafia bosses of the desert. Brass dragons are not looked upon favourably. They're usually described as irresponsible and boorish, not deserving to be considered one of the good guys, and so they're excluded from tungsten dragon activities. Cobalt dragons are the diabolical breed of Ferrous Dragons. They're the exact opposite of the tungsten dragons. They are nasty. They have no goals other than to dominate everyone and anything they come in contact with, including other Ferrous Dragons. At birth, the Cobalt Dragon scales are a dark, deep blue with odd patches of both lighter and darker scales. These colours remain throughout the dragon's life, becoming more prevalent in respect to their age. Cobalt dragons speak their own language, and they look like, and it is suspected that they are in fact the progenitors of all kobolds. They look like kobolds. They have a long snout with prominent canines and little lumpy horns on their head. They look like draconic versions of kobolds. And similar to kobolds, they love to set traps and things. They have a really quite unique way of dealing with things. They'll pepper their entire area with pit traps, rock slides, deadfalls, falling trees, and they cover them all in illusions. They are masters of illusion magic, and they're merciless and very effective in trapping and making the entire area very, very nasty. If you approach any close to them, they will unleash a breath weapon, which is quite unlike most others. It's a pulse of pure magnetic energy, basically a force bolt, 100 feet long and 5 feet wide. Creatures caught in the path of it suffer damage from the impact, flying debris and tumbling out of the way, as this thing just basically pounds them. And it would be so much worse for anybody in metallic armor. They basically just a ringing blast, and they're charged with static electricity as they go pelting off trees and things, and rocks and debris flying all over the place. And you can imagine the impact and sound of this thing blasting out would be quite spectacular, very sci-fi. All creatures caught in the pulse are allowed to save versus the breath weapon for half damage. Creatures wearing ferrous armor at a -4 penalty, so you could say that they basically got disadvantage if you're wearing, I would say, medium or heavy metal armor. Furthermore, creatures that are 2 sizes smaller than the dragon are hurled back 2 to 5 feet per age category of the dragon, so that's from 2 to, 24 feet away or more. They always strike solid objects on the way, generally speaking, because the Cobalt Dragon will line them up to bowl them like pins. And they cast spells. They've up to 7th level, mostly illusion spells. They can breathe water, and they're immune to electricity and the magnetic pulses of other Cobalt Dragons. As they age, they also gain the ability of entangle, improved phantasmal force, growth, and they can summon other creatures. They prefer to dwell deep in dark forests or thick jungles. They've been known to dwell underground, but usually in a shallow cave area with an entrance that's always in a wooded area. They spend most of their time preparing traps, and they feast on the meals of any creatures that get trapped in there, opportunistically. They gather only to mate and when ordered to by their sovereign. Despite their cruelty, they make excellent parents and take care of the young until they reach juvenile age. At this point, the young are forced to leave and never seen again, unless they're if they're seen again, they're attacked unless they have some reason to be there. Cobalt Dragon family groups usually only last for about 25 years at most before their natural aggression falls to bitter feuds and infighting. It's not too uncommon for them to mate for life, but they'll generally only sporadically get back together to breed. And they feed on, as I mentioned, any plant life and animal life in their area. They'll feed on it indiscriminately. Yeah, so nickel dragons are the weakest and smallest of the Ferrous Dragons. They make up for their small size and lesser power by a tenacity and viciousness that would make even the boldest adventurers think twice about wanting to face one a second time. However, they're also somewhat unpredictable in nature, and they can occasionally gulp down somebody, say, well, I'm full, and just let everybody else go, and basically just scarper it. They're a nickel colour, charcoal grey at birth, changing to a more metallic grey, and begins to show a white until, as great worms, they're actually a more bright metallic white in colour. And they can occasionally be confused with white dragons. But yeah, there's other types of dragons which look more like them. And silver dragons occasionally. Their breath weapon is a cloud of acidic vapors, 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 20 feet high. Creatures caught in it basically get very, very irritated. And they dwell in swamps and marshes. Now, most interestingly, they have the ability to cause a violent, itchy, allergic reaction to any creatures that get close to them. It's not exactly clear what this is. It may actually be that they cause a miasma of acidic gas, which just permeates the area around them. And they can concentrate it to burn somebody so that they itch so violently that they have disadvantage as if they're exhausted, or they have to basically strip off their armor and give themselves a good scratch to get rid of it. Or it can be more of a mild thing that actually persists for quite some time, like a rash that just won't go away, which can be quite disconcerting. In a later article, there's actually another article on the Ferrous Dragons from another Dragon magazine. This was June 2007 in Dragon 356, in an article by Kevin Bass and Eric Jansing, with some great illustrations by James Zhang, which we'll be seeing in this video. And if I can just flip to the relevant pages here. Where are we? They've actually got some great examples of actual dragons and the dragon names in this one. Where is it? Here, dragon. Dragon. Iron dragon. So much paper. You guys have no idea how much research I do on these things. Here we are, nickel dragon. So yeah, they're kind of squat. They actually look a little bit like a crocodile-faced sort of thing, with these big horns that sweep back from the head and a frill that runs down their body. And yeah, this mass irritation. Oh, here it is. Itching can affect a number of creatures equal to its age category, so 1 to 12, with an intense itching. So originally in 3.5 edition, because this article was written just when 3.5 was first sort of popping into existence, and yeah, it'll give them -4 penalties to their armor class, so you could say it gives attackers advantage to attack them. Or the rash, which is imposes a it's more like a charisma negative because the rash spreads across their body, and it's just unpleasant looking and causes people to itch constantly, and the rash makes them look like they've got the pox. Yeah. And of course they've got water breathing and stuff, and they spend a lot of their time making deceptive, tenacious, vicious little ploys, and they fight quite often with black dragons in their area. They really hate black dragons. Okay, next up, where are we? Chromium dragons. So the chromium dragons they've got a smooth face. They're very reflective. A frill lined with long spines runs from the snout to the tip of its tail. It has a massive shiny horns running behind its head and down its neck, and its wings are wide and sleek. Its scales gleam like liquid metal, catching the reflections of nearby terrain. They are very often mistaken for being silver dragons, but that's a bad mistake to make because they are evil. They have two types of breath weapon: a line of solid ice, so they basically can squirt water and ice at the same and freeze it at the same time. So it comes out like a lance of ice that spears things in its way, and a cone of freezing crystals. So creatures within a cone of freezing crystals they basically get bludgeoned by it. And a great worm, chromium dragon, can use the ability to, instead of flesh to stone, turn people into crystal. So yeah, it's like a spell, like the flesh to stone spell, except it turns them into crystal, and they're much more vulnerable to being shattered as a result. They live in icy and snowy areas, quite often confused with white dragons or silver dragons as a result. They can pass without trace through snow and ice. They can shape ice and just as if it was stone, and create walls of ice and things. In combat, they're pretty direct, but they tend to retreat, and a common tactic would be for them to land nearby or hover nearby and blast them with a breath weapon, and then either create a obscuring blizzard of ice and snow which powers around them and buffet the entire area with their wings, causing visibility to be very low. So they've got the advantage of ranged attacks, but they make sure that they keep that advantage. Then if melee attackers and things start to charge in, they will erect walls of ice and just soar over top of the walls of ice, and they'll set up shop so that they'll create a wall of ice right in front of a thinly veiled crevasse that they've basically put a thin layer of ice over top of. So you scale the wall, land on the ground turns out to be a thin crust of ice, and then you land on ice spikes in a pit down below. That's a very common tactic of theirs. Then they'll just perch on the top of the pit, and as you're trying to scrabble back up with your lacerated frozen wounds, they'll blast you and turn you into shredded frozen meat. They enjoy toying with their prey, very cat and mouse, and they are extremely cruel and merciless. They love to inflict physical pain, and they're one of the dragons which you have to watch out for because they will do this over an extended period of time, and they'll do it with a great sense of glee. So for them, once the fight starts, they will wound you, and they'll carry on wounding you, and your death may actually be a very protracted affair. They may actually be tasked by their sovereign with gathering information from somebody, and they'll do that always by torture and murder. They have territorial disputes with white dragons, as I've mentioned, and silver dragons. The chromiums always try to dominate a white dragon, and they usually do, but silver dragons are the chromium's deadliest adversary. And it's very easy to mistake the two, which is a very bad thing to do because the chromium is very nasty. Their scales start off as a tarnished silver. Upon reaching adulthood, they brighten, take on an appearance of polished silver, and as they age to a great worm, the old age, they look like chrome. Essentially, they're very reflective and bright coloured chrome. Okay. And I think that's about it for the Ferrous Dragons. Have I missed any? I don't think so. Cobalt, Tungsten, Chrome, Nickel. Yep, and the Iron Dragons. Lovely. Great. One other thing that should be mentioned is that these dragons tend to hoard a lot of stuff. And more so than any others, the Chromium Dragons hoard a lot of stuff. They're very prodigious hoard collectors. Yeah, so that's something interesting. And also the Tungsten Dragons can shape change as well, and quite often do, but the Cobalt Dragons don't shapeshift very often, if at all. It's not observed in the wild. Yeah. So there's plenty more information on those guys, including their size by type and age category, and some other details on them on both of those articles. I can hardly recommend them. If you do have copies of those, Dragon Magazine, or look for them. That issue in particular, the one where it was going over 3.5, and the original issue, were both very heavy on dragon stuff. And there's another article in there from the Dragon 170 on Crossing Dragons with Everything by Gregory W. Detweiler, which I'm going to be covering in the next video on dragons, because it covers dragon crossbreeds such as the Dracomera and the Draco Wyvern, and yeah, that sort of thing. So dragons that are crossbred with other monsters, making some very wicked combos. Thanks for listening to all of this. It's a bit of a long video this time. Thanks everybody. I'll catch you again very shortly.